I want to extend a warm welcome to the survivors and teachers who have joined us tonight, our keynote speakers, Sophia Murray, Kenra Maroz, and to our special guest, Patrick Masko. To the sponsors of this workshop, a heartfelt thank you. We could not have done it without you. I'm pleased to share with you the important message we received from the Prime Minister of Canada, Honorable Justin Trudeau, in honor of Holocaust Education Month.
Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. First, let me thank the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship for the important work they do to continue to teach and preserve the stories of the Holocaust. And thank you to everyone for joining us as we launch this important month of education, learning, and reflection. Le mois de la sensibilisation à l'Holocauste n'est pas seulement l'occasion de réfléchir au chemin que nous avons parcouru, mais aussi à celui qu'il nous reste à parcourir. Parce que la montée des crimes motivés par la haine visant les communautés juives est alarmante et totalement inacceptable. C'est un point que j'ai soulevé il y a quelques mois lors du sommet national sur l'antisémitisme et que je continuerai, ainsi que notre gouvernement, à faire valoir jusqu'à ce que tout le monde au Canada se sente à l'abri de la haine ou de la discrimination. Together, we will continue to fight and reject anti-Semitism in all of its forms. To paraphrase my friend, the late Rabbi Bulka, we can go from the darkest chapter in human history to creating the prospect for a brighter tomorrow. And that journey begins with education and remembrance, which is our most powerful tool against the ignorance and cruelty that fueled the Holocaust. Canada and all Canadians must stand up against anti-Semitic attitudes that still exist in our communities. And we must continue to come together and act on the tragic history of the Holocaust so we can build a better future for everyone. Nous restons inébranlables dans notre engagement à marcher aux côtés de la communauté juive ici et partout dans le monde entier pour lutter contre l'antisémitisme. We continue to pledge, now and forever, never again. Merci.
We sincerely thank the Prime Minister for his commitment to fight in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate across the country. For the benefit of educators who joined us for the first time this afternoon within the Ottawa area and beyond, I would like to share a bit of information about the work of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. CHES was inaugurated in 2015 to answer the growing needs of Holocaust education and the rise of anti-Semitism in Ottawa. CHES is mandated to develop educational programs to promote knowledge and understanding of the history and legacy of the Holocaust and create and offer programs for Holocaust Education Month in November. Our outreach to schools is part of this work. CHES is the only organization in Ottawa offering ongoing teachers' workshop about the lessons and legacies of the Holocaust. Workshops that bring together educators, scholars, survivors, to engage in a profound discussion on the danger of forgetting and the importance of remembrance. Our outreach to school includes the Speakers Bureau, which offers visits by survivors to schools. Before COVID hit us, through both the workshops and survivors' visits to school, CHES reached an average of 10,000 students per year. All the material including the detailed lesson plans of our past workshops are posted on our website under resources and are available to download for free. I am pleased to share that in January 2021, we launched a new chapter in the life of CHES. CHES is now operating independently as a registered charity dedicated to addressing the pressing challenges of growing anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and distortion. The Holocaust provides one of the most effective subjects for examining moral issues. We strive to create better tools and strategies for educators across the province so they can teach and explore the lessons of the Holocaust. Our plans for 2022 include developing, among other things, a project to enhance educational experience for students and visitors at the Canadian Holocaust Monument in Ottawa. I would like to share with you that Honorable Irwin Cotler, Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, was planning to join us this afternoon. Due to a last-minute change in his schedule, he regrets not being here with us. I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I want to let you know that the recording of tonight's session will be available on our website within a day or two. Enjoy the evening and the workshop. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Minda Chaikin. I've been a member of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship since its inception. I chair the Educational Committee. I've coordinated our teachers' workshops with an amazing committee. Thanks to everyone on our committee. We've presented many successful workshops on the Holocaust over the years. All the material as mentioned for the workshops is available to download for free on our website. Welcome to all the new and returning participants. We are so pleased to be presenting our annual Teachers Workshop once again. We're excited about the theme we chose for you this year, Voices of the Holocaust, Inspiring Change Through Legacy, an in-depth exploration of Holocaust survivors' voices. This workshop will explore the need to hear and recognize each other's past, to learn, to listen, and examine our place in remembering the Holocaust and its relevance to our lives today. Unfortunately, we are seeing a steep rise in anti-Semitism in Canada in the last year. It is our responsibility as educators to address this challenge in our schools. We are fortunate to have two remarkable Ottawa educators leading this workshop today. Both are members of the CHESS organization. Sophia Murray is a first-generation Afghan Canadian from Ottawa. She has a BA in Human Rights and an MA in Education with a special emphasis in the pedagogy of human rights and social justice. Kenra Miraz is an English writer's craft and social justice teacher at Sir Robert Borden High School. She also coordinates SRB's Social Justice Club. Kenra is a graduate of the International School for Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem's seminar program for Holocaust educators. Both look forward to working with you tonight in order to promote an understanding of current issues involving discrimination, racism, and anti-Semitism, as well as to encourage equity and diversity in schools and in our global community. I'll pass it over to Kenra.
Thank you, Minda, and welcome everybody. X marks the spot. Circle with a dot. Big red question mark, which brings us to the matter at hand. Whatever shall we do about the Jewish question? Or should we say, the Jewish problem? Perhaps what we shall require is some kind of final solution. Exclusion, expulsion, extermination. Ah, yes, a most excellent suggestion. Yet, how shall we begin? Wherever shall we start? After all, we cannot appear too extreme, as this is a most reasonable concern. We need to explore and examine this situation to the fullest extent. It shall be easy to promote our ideology and deliver this most important of messages through the ironclad control that we exert upon the media. And we all know that the public shall respond to related posters, speeches, warnings, and threats. with no need for us to fully explain. Yet, how are we to truly bring our message home? Is that not the cherished place in which the family heart resides? Perhaps we ought to make things simple after all. Simple is always best, is it not? Something that is familiar, comforting, enjoyable, where the entire family can participate together and strive towards a common and exact objective, which mirrors our own, where both question and answer are mere child's play. What are we to do? Get rid of every Jew, no exceptions. So simple and yet extraordinarily exciting. Everyone can join in our game. Some might even become experts in their own right, or should we say, recht. What fun we shall have. This is how it began, with the goal being complete and total extermination. However, people did survive, and eventually they decided to tell their stories. In the summer of 2019, I attended the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem Summer Scholarship Program at the International School for Holocaust Studies. And as my little explanation blurb explains, this poem was written in response to a Nazi propaganda display in one of the early exhibition rooms in the Holocaust History Museum at Yad Vashem. And I found myself frozen in front of the so-termed board games, which were created to build and encourage anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiment. And the goal of these games is ultimately to get rid of as many Jews as possible. For me, it painted a very disturbing picture of parents and children gathered rather companionably around these games, enjoying family time together. As part of the process of my follow-up through working with the ideas and lessons that I learned and experienced through this program, I ended up writing 2 full collections of poetry, 2 collections of monologues, as well as a collection of perspective pieces. So needless to say, this was a tremendously inspiring experience for me. And what I really want to emphasize today regarding our workshop is, out of all of the many, many things that I experienced when I was in Israel, among the many, many things that inspired me to write and compose and share, one of the top of these experiences was listening to and learning from Holocaust survivors. The focus, as you know, of today's workshop is local survivor testimonies and encouraging their exploration and use in the classroom. And while there are many, many reasons for this, 2 of the most important that I want to share with you today are as follows. Number 1, we know that this is a means of ensuring that the history and legacy of the Holocaust and the lived experiences that bear witness to this history and legacy are not forgotten. And secondly, we also recognize the fact that Holocaust history and legacy and the lessons and testimonies that correspond to it demonstrate and continue to demonstrate significant and relevant means by which we can address and understand all forms of discrimination, both historical and current. An exploration of Holocaust education opens the doors to discussions regarding bullying, inclusion versus exclusion, the concept of allyship and what that means to be an ally. It examines social justice issues, human rights issues, and ways in which we can make connections between Holocaust history and legacy and things that we're currently seeing today. One of the most important discussion points and activities that Sophia is going to lead a little bit later on in the session has to do with the examination of journeys taken by Ottawa-based survivors and ways in which to encourage students to make connections to these survivor stories, whether it be through reflecting on their own journeys, whether it be through the concept of They're local survivors. These people could be people we pass every day and we don't realize. So certainly there's a lot that we're going to be covering that really bring home the point that our local survivor testimonies are very, very important resources and continue to be tremendously relevant to the work that we do and to the things that we see going on in our world today and in our communities as well. As with any subject matter that can be sensitive, difficult, and even triggering, it's always important to take some time in which to prepare our students as well as ourselves for the exploration of this material, which is why I am going to take a little bit of time today before Sophia goes into the main workshop to talk to you a little bit about best practices, how to lead our students safely in and safely out of exploring Holocaust history and legacy. And part of what I would like to do as well in sharing this with you is also share with you some of my, I suppose, rules of thumb, 3 of them anyways, when I delve into exploring the Holocaust with my students. And certainly for me as an educator, Holocaust history and legacy have always been integral components to what I do. And generally my first rule of thumb, and people probably know this as educators, is unless what we're teaching as a course is very specific to the Holocaust, it's always a good idea to give a little bit of time to get to know your students, for the students to get comfortable in the classroom, to get used to you as well, simply because starting off really early with an exploration of subject matter that can be sensitive and difficult can provide some challenges. So November, January, and April are all great months because they correspond with Holocaust recognition and memorial and observation. So I would highly recommend giving a little bit of time. What I like to start with when I'm exploring any kind of unit using the Holocaust, whether it be activities, corresponding lessons, an entire unit, is to, without allowing the students to check anything in class, like get on the internet or start Googling things, I'll simply ask them to take about 10 to 15 minutes to write down everything that they know or think that they know about the Holocaust. And the other thing that I'll ask them to do while they're thinking about what they know or think they might know is to also note the sources from which they received this information. And that, of course, is always a great way to open a discussion regarding reliable versus unreliable sources, because unfortunately, in this day and age, it does not take long, doesn't matter what search engine you're using, for example, in Googling the Holocaust, for sites to come up and connections to come up that are not necessarily reliable and that in fact will distort and deny the reality of the Holocaust. So I always like to start with these discussions early as well. Once my students have had a chance to think a little bit about what's in their heads regarding the Holocaust, there's 1 or 2 approaches that I take depending on the class. Normally, I will go right into a bit of a share and I'll say to them, okay, let's hear from you. What are some of the things in your mind? What do you know or think you know about the Holocaust? I will, however, always provide an opportunity for my students to maybe email their thoughts to me if they don't want to be called upon, if they're a little bit shy. So there will always be that option so that everybody can share their thoughts and share what's in their minds without necessarily feeling that they're going to be spotlit. I do happen to find that the overwhelming majority of my students are happy to share. So we'll take some notes. We'll take a look at where they're coming from in terms of what they think, what they know, and from where they got that information. After we've had a chance to look a little bit at those details, my second most important thing to do is actually start talking about some facts. So we will explore what is the Holocaust. And I generally like to use present tense because although, yes, this does correspond to a period in history, the Holocaust continues to be current and relevant. And oftentimes this will allow me to discuss what is history and what is legacy with my students and how the two correspond and connect. The next thing that I will move on to, of course, is who was targeted and why, with very specific emphasis upon the European Jewish population. And that, of course, will lead us into discussions regarding how hatred, intolerance, as well as lies and deception can lead to destruction. So there's a lot that I like to build before I even go into lessons. And when Sophia, of course, is presenting her workshop activities for you, she'll also be emphasizing the importance of understanding the Holocaust and getting a sense of what it involved before we delve into really specific activities. My second rule of thumb is to always allow time and space for your students as well as yourself to process the information that's being shared and the research that is being done, as the case may be. And once again, I have a few ways that I approach this. I like to have my students journal. So whether it's one day that we're doing some activities, whether it's a series of lessons that go for a week or so, or in the case of my writer's craft class, where we do an entire 2-month-long unit, which explores the Holocaust in the Diary of Anne Frank, they are journaling. So I want them to put down the thoughts that are in their minds at the end of the lesson or things that might occur to them during the lesson. And we will eventually take some time for people to share their thoughts. And that can be done on a periodic basis if it's a longer lesson or unit, or it can be divided up within the class itself. The students, again, have the opportunity to share their thoughts out loud, and most do. But the nice thing about the journaling is this allows me to see what the responses of my students are, no matter whether they're sharing them out loud so that we can all hear them, or whether they feel the need to share them more privately. And I will always address all of the topics that come up in the thoughts, respecting, of course, anonymity, because it is integral for us as educators, and I believe it is our responsibility to know how our students are processing this information, how they're handling the information, and how they're understanding the information, so that we can address these things with them, particularly if students are triggered by any of the subjects that are discussed or any of the elements that are examined in further detail. My third rule of thumb, of course, is do not be afraid to say, I don't know. If a student asks a question to which you do not know the response, and to invite everybody to see if we can find the answer together. And that, of course, is a great way to bring things back to reliable versus unreliable sources of information. So all of these rules of thumb to me as a Holocaust educator have been very, very helpful. And we certainly want to encourage our students to think about the importance of Holocaust history and legacy. We want to encourage them to think about ways in which this history and legacy continues to be meaningful, ways in which we connect, but we do want to make sure that we're always doing it safely and with the interests of the students first and foremost. Some examples of myths versus facts that Sophia's workshop is going to go into today, and that pertain to the stories shared by local Ottawa survivors, consist of some of the following elements. Unfortunately, more and more today, we hear people saying, well, the Holocaust happened over there, as in far away overseas in Europe, and a long, long time ago. Therefore, it really doesn't have much to do with us or our current situation. And of course, we know that that is simply not the truth. Holocaust survivors could be grandparents, great-grandparents of people whom we know. They are our neighbors. They are community volunteers, they are business owners, they are educators. So definitely the Holocaust, especially in the voices of local survivors, is very much a part of who we are, and going forward, continuing to make those connections. A second thought and subject that sometimes comes up in discussion regarding the Holocaust, and sometimes ideas that are surrounding the Holocaust, is that generally when survivors did resettle in countries like Canada, resources, help, aid was readily available for them, and that people transitioned very smoothly. And of course, listening to the survivor stories, if you access them through our CHESS website, you will certainly understand that this was not the case. There were many barriers to survivors when they did, in fact, become relocated. Resources were not always readily available. There were wonderful organizations, of course, and that did help. Some were fortunate enough to have relatives or sponsors. But then there's the reality of the trauma of the Holocaust and the very strong personal impact that this had on survivors, and the fact that they themselves had a lot of work to do in terms of even understanding or starting to process what had happened to them. And indeed, many who share their stories will tell us that they're among the lucky ones, and that really the majority of survivors did not speak. They did not share their stories because of the trauma associated with that. So that's always something very important to bear in mind. So before I turn things over to Sophia to continue with the main workshop, one thing that I would invite you all to reflect on as Sophia is presenting and as we're taking you through the activities today is perhaps your own personal journey that brought you here to this workshop this evening. So once again, I thank you very much for your presence here, for your participation, and I will look forward to joining you a little bit later on.
All right, thank you so much, Kenra, for kicking things off for me there. Hi, everybody. Thank you again for being here tonight. I just want to acknowledge just how important it is simply to show up. So much gratitude to each of you for being here for our workshop tonight. So hello, as Kenra mentioned, I'm Sophia, and to be honest, there isn't much that's interesting about me, except for the fact that I myself am a product of Holocaust education. So I was exposed to Holocaust education at quite a young age. I was in grade 6, and my grade 6 teacher really went above and beyond the curriculum, because at the time and even currently, Holocaust education isn't actually part of the mandated curricula that teachers are supposed to teach, at least not in the elementary years. But he had made it an effort to implement it in our classroom learning. And so I learned all about the Holocaust, the events that led up to it, and sort of the challenging questions around it. And part of that included hearing testimony from an Ottawa-based survivor. So the late Mr. David Shinto came into our class, and I vividly remember the words that he spoke. I vividly remember, being in the library and hearing him share his story. And I vividly remember the emotions that I experienced during his testimony, and the lessons that he taught us around values like humility and character and resilience and respect, and sort of having this open-minded and very deeply accepting and a non-judgmental approach to those around us and the world around us. Those values really lie at the heart of the way in which I interact with the world, and the way in which I move through the world, and the way in which I live my life. And so I'm all too familiar with the resoundingly positive impact that Holocaust education can have on students and communities at large. And so that is precisely why I'm here with you all today, to ensure that I can help move the needle forward towards greater integration of these sorts of pedagogies in Ottawa schools, so that other students might also have that sort of positive experience and learn the same lessons that I was afforded. So that's what brings me here. I present, I'm a huge advocate for the student perspective in Holocaust education, because I experienced it myself. And with that being said, let's dive right into our workshop portion. Wonderful. So I'm now going to spend some time walking you through the actual content, well, some of the content of the lesson plans, just so you can familiarize yourself with some of the activities in there. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And let's put this in full view mode. Wonderful. All right, so let's start with lesson one. One of the main activities in lesson one is a gallery walk activity. So let's take a look at that. There are essentially 3 Jamboard links that your students can use, and each Jamboard link contains a set of images from different eras. So the first one, for example, focuses on anti-Semitism leading up to the Holocaust. The second one are images from the Holocaust itself. And then there are contemporary images of anti-Semitism that are much more recent within the Canadian context. So these are the 3 Jamboard themes. Let's click on one of them and check it out. So now we've entered the very first Jamboard link. And let's just look through some of these pages, these slides. So a lot of this Jamboard contains images of propaganda used in Nazi Germany. And each of the images also includes a descriptor under it, a sort of caption, just to contextualize it. That's really important, so that your students kind of get a little bit of sense of like what this is. But there's also enough room for them to reflect and interpret it on their own. And then again, more images of propaganda. And there are also slides like this one, which are pause and reflect slides. Now, these slides, allow students to pause, absorb the images they just saw, and then do some reflection around them. So, for example, asking questions like, based on your observations, how are Jewish people portrayed in the propaganda images that you just saw? So those are pause and reflect slides, and they are sort of added throughout the Jamboard. So after a certain set of images, you always end up at a pause and reflect slide. Again, these are some images of boycotts that were done against Jewish-owned businesses, and then images from the Night of the Broken Glass, just to give students a sense of what these events look like, right? That's important. And images of vandalism. And again, questions like, what impact do you think that Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, had on the Jewish community? And they can come in here and add their own thoughts. Now, a tip I have is to actually copy each Jamboard slide deck, so that you can have your own copy specifically for your students. Otherwise, this is a public Jamboard, and other people might have added their comments to these slides. So I highly recommend that you copy these over and you have your own copy for your classroom. All right, let's go ahead and check out perhaps a second Jamboard, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Actually, let's look at post-Holocaust. Whoops. Wonderful. So these are more contemporary images of anti-Semitism. I've included images from social media, so this makes that linkage between anti-Semitism and other forms of racist speech to digital platforms, especially social media, and it links it to this idea of online hate speech, which is a tremendously big problem for Jewish communities, especially, but also other minority groups. So these are some examples. I've tried to keep the examples quite recent. And then there's also examples of memes. This is something that students are already familiar with. They know about memes. They view memes. Some students view memes on a daily basis or multiple times a day, but they might not be as aware of how memes can be used in racist ways, in anti-Semitic ways. And so this is a really good way of introducing them to that, to kind of see the flip side of memes. So some more memes, another pause and reflect slide, and then some examples of other forms of contemporary anti-Semitism. For example, this is some vandalism that was done in a Toronto school. So again, this is a good example because it happened in a school. And it happened not too far from them, right? In Ontario. So I tried to select images like this one, that these ones occurred in Ottawa, you know, in a synagogue and on the door of someone's home, just to show students that this problem is not something that exists far away. It's not something that just happened in Europe and is continuing to happen in Europe. This is something that is a reality for Jewish communities right here in Ottawa, right? So that gives you a nice sense of what the gallery walk slides, Jamboard slides look like. Let's take a look at some of the survivor profiles. So I've included a profile, just a short snippet for each survivor that Chess has a video for. So I highly recommend that you read these survivor profiles and that you watch the testimonials before showing them to your students. This will help you select the right ones for your classroom. And survivor testimony is incredibly important. It's really important to listen to the stories of survivors because, again, those images in the gallery walk activity are great. They're a great starting point, but this is really where students can build empathy. And this is really where it becomes humanized and it becomes really, really real for students. So the voices of survivors are absolutely integral. So these are the survivor profiles, and I've included some activities. So aside from just watching the testimonies, I've also included like a 5-minute essay, a think, pair, share activity, a life story activity where they sort of spend some time delving into the different aspects of the survivor's life story, and then they think about their own life stories and how what are the similarities and what are some of the differences. So this is the life story graphic, also the mapping legacy activity, and a note from a survivor and some reflection questions around that. So we're going to start off by sharing a testimonial video, a little clip of it. As mentioned earlier, Chess has many survivor testimony videos on their website, and they can be accessed by you at any time. You can go and there's many of them. They're typically around 20 to 30 minutes each. And so I've selected a 5-minute video clip from one of them, and we're going to watch it. And then we're going to do a quick activity, and then we'll discuss some best practices around using testimonials in our classrooms. So let's go ahead and play that video clip of Tova Clark.
My mother worked as a head cashier in a very large department store, Lohman Brothers, and she told me a story when an SS officer came in and asked her boss, what is this Jewish woman still doing working there? And the next day she had to leave. They didn't have a choice. And my father, before the war, he had a store selling men's fabrics. He imported fabrics from Savile Row in London, and it was a very large store, and he had a partner by the name of Stiebel, and the name of the store was Stiebel and Wolf. It was all very gradual. Every day there was a new edict. Every day there was something. One day my mother couldn't take me to the park anymore. Jewish babies were not allowed to go to the parks. Another day, Jewish students were not allowed to go to university anymore. And I have a cousin, he's no longer alive, who was studying law, and he had to leave university. So every day there was some new edict. Maybe that was the reason why so many people didn't see the writing on the wall and didn't leave earlier, because it was so gradual. From what my mother told me, most of their friends were Jewish, but they definitely interacted with non-Jews. And she told me a story that in their building, of course, there were Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and she was quite friendly with a non-Jewish woman. And one day she just chatted with her on the stairs, and her son in full Nazi uniform came over and yelled at his mother, telling her, "What are you doing, still talking to this Jewish woman?" He used some swear words, which I will not repeat. And from that day on, this woman didn't talk to her anymore. My father had a store, and it was called Stiebel and Wolf. The name of his partner was Herr Stiebel. And on Kristallnacht, the SA men came, smashed all the windows. They came with these big scissors, cut up the fabrics, took away my father's partner, left my father, didn't do anything with him. Why, I don't know. They took him away to a concentration camp, and my mother tried to get him out. So there was a Nazi headquarters nearby, and she was a very attractive woman, and she had guts, and she went, and she said, "I want to see the commandant." And so they sent her upstairs and knocked on the door and went into the office, and he was looking over some papers, and she said, "I want to get Mr. Stiebel out of the concentration camp." And he said to her, "You have guts to come to me," and I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I want." She was very self-assured, she was attractive, and I guess he was impressed with the bravery that she was showing. So he wrote down the name, and Mr. Stiebel was released, but in terrible, terrible condition, and soon after he died.
So we just put the full video in the chat for you. And again, there are several other videos, full videos that you can access on the CHESS website. So now that we've watched a short snippet of Tova Clark's testimony, I want us to quickly take a moment to perhaps grab a piece of paper or a pen, a pencil, or perhaps open up a Word document if you prefer. And we're going to do a really quick writing activity. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to find a writing utensil and some paper, and I'll take this opportunity to take a drink of water. All right, so if we are all ready with our writing utensil and paper or a Word document, we're going to start our writing activity. So this is an activity that some of you who are educators might already be familiar with this. I call this the 5-minute essay. And the idea is to start writing anything that comes to mind that's related to the testimony, the clip of the testimony that we just watched, without lifting your pen off of the paper. So the idea is to keep writing continuously for 5 minutes. I will mind the time. I will put on a very short timer on my phone here for 5 minutes. And I'll let you all know when the 5 minutes is up. So again, you put your pen down on your paper and you write continuously whatever comes up, whether it's emotions, thoughts, comments, just write. And so I'll give you all the cue to start now. All right, so my timer just went off. So this is the time to put your pens down or finish writing down your last few words. But feel free, if you feel like you'd like to continue, you can also do so. But I will move on. So 5 minutes is up. Take a moment now to review what you have written down. And once we've done that, I'd love to hear, what are some of the themes? What are some of the general sentiments that came up while you were writing? Feel free to share in the chat. I can talk a little bit about what I wrote down. So I was really impressed by the way in which Tova articulated and relayed her mother's memories. And also what stood out to me was the gradual nature of the racist laws and the impact that the edicts had on the day-to-day lives of Jews. So that also stood out to me while I was watching the testimony, but I'll let you all chime in as well and share your thoughts. It could be, comments, questions, perhaps questions arose. Perhaps it was, you described your emotions or your reaction. Feel free to put those in the chat and I will read them out for everyone. And while I'm waiting for people to input their comments in the chat, I did want to mention that this is a really great activity because it's short, it's easy, and it allows students to really digest the content of the testimony that they just watched, and also to help get their juices flowing a little bit so that they can then go into a more deeper dive or perhaps a deeper discussion about some of the themes and the concepts and the experiences that were relayed in the testimony. So this is a nice way for students to dip their toes into these discussions a little bit, and to, again, Kenra mentioned the importance of allowing students to reflect and giving them the space to sort of express what they are understanding or what they are experiencing as they learn about the Holocaust. And so journaling, this is kind of a form of journaling a little bit. And it's a great way, again, to get students to digest this information so that it's not something that is intimidating for them to get into in terms of discussion. Wonderful. So I'm seeing some things fall into the chat. I will just read them. So someone in the chat said, I too was struck by the incremental erosion of rights, as well as the alleged brazenness of her mother in doing something that we all take for granted, being able to speak to the authorities. That's a very good point. Finally, I wonder how many non-Jewish Germans had clothes made at Stiebel's store. Yeah, that's a good point too. I wonder as well. And for me, it was actually interesting because I had seen the edicts in writing before, but to actually learn through the testimony in that little clip, even though it was quite a short clip, to understand, like, what did that mean for the day-to-day experiences of people? What did that actually look like? Because seeing it written down and actually hearing what that experience was like is two different things, right? Some other comments in the chat. Tova mentions a young Hitler youth's comments, which reminds us how young minds can be manipulated and how hatred can be taught. Absolutely. I think the example that you're referring to there is the young man who told his mother, not to talk to the Jewish neighbor. So yes, absolutely. Young minds are easily manipulated. And I would argue adult minds are often easily manipulated as well, right? Someone also said, I teach history and was struck by how impactful the personal story of a person living through these world events is, and brings the world events down to earth and makes them more real and personal for us. Absolutely. That is the power really of testimony. It makes it real because you see a person. It's not just a concept or an abstraction or something that happened over there. This is a person living here, and it doesn't really matter where they live, but this is a person and they experience this. So it does make it much more real. The personal stories really bring to life these massive events in history. The testimony highlighted that Jewish people were not passive victims and they resisted this discrimination. I think that's very important to point out. The mother trying to save her husband's colleague was an incredibly brave act. Absolutely, yeah. There's many different layers to these memories, right? And acts of bravery are part of them as well. And sort of these little ways that we can resist. Despite the so-termed order that the edicts were meant to represent, decisions were made that were still completely random. One person is spared and another is not. Thank you for that comment, Kenra. Absolutely. Wonderful. So thank you for sharing those reactions, those comments, those questions in the chat for me. I think I was able to read all of them. I don't think I missed anything. Nope, I think I'm okay. So again, as I mentioned, a very simple activity to get your students started in your classroom to help them reflect, to help them digest these testimonies. Again, that was just a short, 5-minute little clip, and look at how much we already have to discuss, right? So I highly encourage you all to check out the full testimony, and we're going to move on a little bit and talk about the best practices of how to actually integrate these testimonies properly in our classrooms. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen really quickly because I wrote some of these best practices down. Some of them do overlap with what Kenra already mentioned, but some of them are a little bit more sort of targeted towards the use of testimonials. So let me go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, perfect. So can we all see my screen? I just want to make sure that we're all good with that. You can give me a thumbs up or just an indication. I'm going to assume that you can all see my screen. Okay. Wonderful. So here I have a couple of best practices that I've laid out for us when we want to include testimonies in our classrooms. Something that Kenra already mentioned is always, always, always give context about the Holocaust before introducing testimony. You never want to introduce testimony without first talking about the historical context of the Holocaust first. So that is very important. Kenra mentioned, an activity where you can, with your students, just take 10 minutes and ask them what they already know before moving towards diving deeper into the events of the Holocaust and before introducing testimony. Also keep in mind that each testimony is one snapshot of a larger picture and emphasize the uniqueness of everyone's perspectives and experiences. Not all Holocaust survivors had the exact same experience, and experiences are very complex and nuanced. So it's important to understand that this is one sort of experience, but it's part of a larger picture, and that every survivor's experience is unique to them, right? Survivors are also more than just survivors, and try not to simplify their identities. We want to see survivors as more than just people who survived the Holocaust. There's so much more to them and who they are, and we don't want to simplify them in that way, simplify their identities in that way. The other best practice is something that was already mentioned by Kenra. Always connect the testimony, or try to connect this testimony to students' own lives. And in the lesson plans, there are deliberate activities that try to do this, that try to create this connection between the lives of students and the lives of Holocaust survivors. Because when students can relate and in that way, it's a lot easier for them to grasp this information. Wonderful. And next, the next best practice I have on here is be mindful of how your students may be feeling and reacting to this testimony. I remember when I heard Mr. David Shinto's testimony, there was a wide range of emotions that I experienced. And so we want to be mindful as teachers about what our students are experiencing as they're going through this journey, because every student is going to be different, you know, and to be mindful of those differences amongst your students is also important. And again, to take it slow. You don't want to dump them with all of this all at once. So the next best practice I have is to demonstrate the intergenerational impacts of the Holocaust so that students are aware of the legacy of racism, not just about the way in which it operated in the past. I think Kenra also kind of touched on this. And the rest of the other three are, I think, quite straightforward. And again, Kenra might have already mentioned some of them, getting to know your students before diving into testimonies. I also, as an added best practice, would say to go on the CHESS website and actually watch the testimonies in full. It's time consuming, but it's very enriching, and you get to know what the content is, so you can select the testimonies that you think would work best for your grade level, for the age of your students, for the readiness of your students. So become familiar with the content, because when you do introduce the testimony to your students, I think it's best to preface it by saying, you know, this is what you can expect from this testimony. There's this kind of content in it. You kind of want to give them a sense of what is the testimony about, what topics it might touch on, because some students might be really sensitive to certain topics, right? So you want to sort of preface the testimony by giving them a little bit of idea, so it's helpful to know the content beforehand. And again, Ken already mentioned this, but you don't have to have all the answers. And again, Chess is here to support you in that regard. So always feel free to reach out to Chess for any support that you might need. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Those were some best practices that I wanted to highlight. I'm going to give Kenra the chance to pop in here just in case I might have forgotten anything.
Am I back in? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So, Sophia, I think you pretty much covered the overwhelming majority of it. The only thing that I might come back to just a little bit is the whole aspect of knowing your students, particularly when it comes to possible triggers. And some of the more serious kind of triggers are students who may have experienced abuse or severe bullying, families that may have experienced discrimination in their home countries and are now settling in Canada, and also particularly be mindful of your Jewish students. I've heard a lot from my own students who are members of the Jewish community who have said a few things. You know, I always like to check with them, and oftentimes their families, when I'm going into some very in-depth exploration of the Holocaust, as we do have students who have grandparents who are survivors and great-grandparents. And Jewish students also do not like to be spotlit when we're covering survivor stories or Holocaust. So it's important to be mindful that this is an experience for everybody, and in any kind of exploration of any form of social justice issue or human rights issue, members of the particular community whom we are exploring do not like to have the spotlight shone on them. They simply would like to be part of the collective and be contributing as they see fit.
Thank you, Kenra, for those wonderful additions. Absolutely. I definitely agree with the point about not spotlighting Jewish students. It is not their job to educate their peers about the Holocaust, right? So that's a really good one. Thank you for adding that. Wonderful. Okay, so that was our first activity. Again, very simple. And I wanted to kind of focus on that one because we don't have too much time in this workshop. So I didn't want to throw any, long-winded activities your way. But that's a really useful one to get started in your classroom. Okay, so now we're going to go into going through some of the content that is in the lesson plans, just so that you can start to familiarize yourself with, the kinds of activities that are there, what are the themes that are explored in the lesson plans, so that you can, decide whether you want to use them in your classrooms. I hope that by the end of this, you do feel like you want to use them. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And this time I will show you some content from the lesson plans. Wonderful. Okay, so let's move through this a little bit. Okay, so we talked a lot about student well-being in Holocaust education already. So there's actually a second section in the lesson plan that you can reference before you start to integrate Holocaust education with your students in your classroom. These are just some general guidelines that can help you. It talks a little bit about consent, getting consent from your students before delving into these topics and these matters, holding space for difficult emotions. We talk about doing that, but what does that actually look like? So there are some guidelines around those pieces in the actual lesson plan document. And again, a couple other things like not invalidating sadness with hope. I think it's important to include hope in some way when we're teaching about the Holocaust, but to not overdo it, to be very diligent about not sugarcoating things, events related to the Holocaust. So that's really important. There's some guidelines about that. And then seeking extra support for your students if necessary. So there are 2 pages in there with some tips and tricks about how to go about making sure that you're taking care of your students' well-being while they're going through this journey of Holocaust education. And so our first lesson talks about or sort of details the history of anti-Semitism through the use of images. And in this lesson, there are 2 main activities. There's a gallery walk, and then there's a research activity. The gallery walk is split into 3 different galleries. The first gallery explores anti-Semitism pre-Holocaust, in the pre-Holocaust era. And again, it's through images. And the second gallery focuses on images from the Holocaust itself. And the third one displays images of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. And I did my best to find examples within the Canadian context, because I think it's important to show students that anti-Semitism is a real thing that occurs in Canada and in their local communities. So there are some Ottawa examples in there. Now, the galleries are, the platform that the galleries are on is Jamboard. So if you're an educator, you're probably very familiar with Jamboard. So you can just copy over the Jamboard and have it for your students. And the nice thing about this as well is that it doesn't just include images, but it also has some Jamboard slides where students are prompted to pause and reflect. And so there are some reflection questions. Some of them are very simple. Some of them are a little bit more critical. And that allows students, that allows this experience to be more active and engaging versus students simply just passively absorbing images, right? And that's not always, the best approach to take. So we have images, we have pause and reflect slides where they can stop and reflect on what they just saw. And then there's a research component where they get to dive in a little bit more deeply into some of the images that they saw, some of the themes that come up in the images, and kind of create their own inquiry around the topics that interest them regarding the Holocaust. I'm just going to quickly check the chat to make sure. Wonderful. So there's a question about where we can find these lessons. They will be posted on the CHEST website within the next couple days. I'll let Minna talk about that at the very end, but they will be on there very, very soon. Great. So the second lesson, it focuses on the voices of Holocaust survivors more specifically. So it includes showing testimony and activities like the 5-minute essay that we just did. And then another activity that I wanted to sort of spotlight, I obviously cannot show you the entire content of the lesson plans. It's quite a hefty document and we simply just do not have time to go through all of it. But one of the activities that I did want to spotlight is this mapping activity. And, we talked about earlier on about this idea of connecting student lives to Holocaust lives. So this one kind of focuses a little bit on that. So the idea here is for students to use a mapping software that's accessible to anyone. It's free. It's on Google. I think it's called, Google My Maps. And they get to re-watch or re-listen to the Holocaust testimony. And then the idea is to have students map the journeys of the Holocaust survivors up until they come to Canada, and because they all settled here in Ottawa. And this kind of sort of allows students to visually see, this is where the survivor was, this is where they were born, this is where they moved to, and this is how eventually they ended up here in Canada. And then the nice part about this is that it also prompts students to do the same for their own journeys. A lot of students, if they have moved to Canada and they once lived somewhere else, or they were born somewhere else, or if their families are from another country, this is an opportunity for them to also map their familial or their personal journeys to Canada as well, to kind of create that connection, and that way they can visually see both journeys. And it also is accompanied by several reflective exercises, some discussion around, what were the challenges for the Holocaust survivor to get from Europe to Canada? What are the challenges that they faced once they were here? And what were your challenges, coming here, your journey? And once you were here, what are some of the challenges that your family faced? So I've also included a little tutorial video if any of you are not familiar with the platform already, so your students can sort of watch that. It's very student friendly, and the user interface is quite easy to use. So that is one of the activities. And then in the third lesson, we really focus on helping students, or helping build student capacity to take action on anti-Semitism and actually address it in some way. So I'm going to show a couple different activities that I've included here. There's, for example, a case study. So a case study on the White Rose movement, which is a youth movement in Germany that resisted the fascist regime. So they go through a case study. And then they also learn about youth activism in Canada specifically. So these are examples of youth-led initiatives that address racism in Canada, just so that they can kind of get an idea of what is being done already by youth across the country to address racism in different forms. And then they also learn about different tactics that they can use when they are taking action against issues like racism and anti-Semitism. And so in this tactic worksheet, they can sort of list out the pros and cons, the disadvantages and the disadvantages of certain tactics, and in what situations you might want to use a certain tactic. So kind of familiarize themselves with different ways of taking action and addressing anti-Semitism. And both, I included both digital and traditional tactics. And then once they have a project idea, this is kind of the fun part for them, is putting together a project canvas, helping them think through the high-level questions around their action project. What is the motivation of your project? What is the goal behind? What are the goals that you want to achieve through your project? What is the message that you want to give to people? What are the tactics, both traditional and digital, that you might use to conduct this project? What are some potential risks or challenges that you might face when you're carrying out this project? How might you overcome these potential challenges? What resources might you need, and who will this benefit, and how will it benefit? Just to get them thinking about this. And then there are also some worksheets around team planning, and some reflective exercises once they've done their action project. They need to reflect on what went well and what they can improve on, and what were the lessons learned and the takeaways. And I do want to emphasize that although it's nice to have a project that does really well, that achieves all the goals that students set out to achieve, I will say from experience working with young people on projects that the goals are not always met, and that is totally fine. It really is about the process. Students, as they move through this process of addressing anti-Semitism in their local communities, they're going to learn a whole lot. And that learning process and that skill building process is really what we need to focus on as educators, not so much the end product of what they come up with in terms of a project and how they execute it. That is nice too, but the process here is what's really the meat and bones for students. So that's what we really want to emphasize. And then some guidelines around how they can share their stories. You know, it's important to share so that perhaps it might inspire other people to take action on anti-Semitism. And there are some other reflective pieces as well, but I'll stop sharing my screen now. So that's a little bit about a little overview of some of the content that is in the lesson plans. And I did also want to talk a bit about sort of the rationale behind the inclusion of this action project section. So lesson 3 really focuses on the action piece. And what I've come to know and understand with all of my experience is that learning about the details of the Holocaust and the horrors that the survivors endured, and really the persistence of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in the modern era, it really can weigh very heavily on students, and left as is, it can disempower students and really leave them feeling quite disillusioned. So to help mitigate this risk of, students feeling disempowered or disillusioned, we turn to collective action. So studies actually show that when students engage in some form of action, it helps them feel empowered and capable of creating positive change. And this is why our inclination is to take a student-centered and action-oriented approach. So that's that. Now I'd like for us to consider, the different types of actions that students might take. And so let's reflect on what we might consider appropriate or inappropriate in terms of different sorts of actions. And we're going to go through a quick little activity. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard very soon, and I'll create a Venn diagram, and I'll walk you through this exercise. And I just want to take a moment to do that. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up a whiteboard here for us. Oh, it's already there. Wonderful. So great. So I'm going to create 3 little circles here. Well, I have 2 circles already. And the first one is going to be the what would you condone category. So these are actions, if a student comes to you and they detail the details of their project, would you condone it? So if you would condone it, if you would accept it and say, yes, go ahead with this project idea, then it'll fall under this category, okay? And then the other piece is, what would you not condone? What would you absolutely not condone if your students came to you and you said, this is our project idea, this is what we want to do? What would you not condone? And then there's sort of the in-between area where you might condone it, you might accept it if there were perhaps some changes or revisions to their plan. So that's that. And thank you so much for putting the list of actions in the chat for me. I will read them out one at a time, and our task collectively, and I'm going to really rely on the audience here to help me sort of sift through this list and place them in the different categories. So please participate as much as you can by using the chat. So I will read each of these project ideas out loud, and use the chat to let me know which category you would put it in. And then I'll reflect that in the diagram here. Perfect. And just to keep in mind that there aren't always right answers, so all viewpoints are welcome. I don't necessarily think that there is a right answer to some of these examples. Okay, wonderful. So the first project idea that I have here is students follow a local election in all of its stages, and they interview voters in their community about racism, and then they post those interviews on social media. Then they also attend local election meetings to raise awareness about the rise of anti-Semitism in their city. So is this a project idea that you would condone, an action that you would condone, or not condone, not accept? Let me know in the chat what you all think. And feel free, if you'd like, to put some explanation beside your answer as well. It always helps to have some explanation. Okay, so Derek said in the chat that they would condone, so they would accept it. Very action-oriented, and students would develop a lot of skills and interact with their community. That's a really good explanation. So I will put that in the condone category for now. So number one will go in there. Someone else in the chat said no, because it would spotlight people's views publicly. Yep, so only if students get permission. That's a very, very good point, Hernan. That's important for students to take into consideration consent. So perhaps condoning, but only if they get the consent of people that they're interviewing before they post on social media. So I really, really like that. It might be difficult to get principal approval for that. That is a good point. But otherwise, if that wasn't a factor, we will leave it in the would condone category for now. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. I will move on to the next one. Students host a press conference to raise awareness about the work that they are doing to combat racism in their community. Okay, so someone in the chat said that they would condone. Perfect. So I'll put it in that category. Yep. So if they are sharing details about the action that they're taking, that's always great, right? So I would condone, since it's local, it offers the chance to other town residents to join and learn if they are interested. Absolutely. Yep. Students are encouraged to share what they are doing to tackle racism. So number two will also go in this category. Wonderful. Okay, next one. Let's see what we have next. Students create a social media hashtag campaign using the slogan hashtag Jewish Lives Matter. Yes, press conferences do have to be school board approved. I might actually encourage students to use, instead of a press conference, perhaps having like a virtual event, like a virtual school event where they can talk about the actions that they're taking in their community. So that might be something that might be a little bit more feasible. So I encourage you all to have these discussions with your students when they come up with ideas, to help them think through, what is the feasibility of this? What are the steps that you need to take in order to make this happen, right? That's important. So thank you for that, Ruth. Very helpful. All right, so the next one, which category potentially could we put the next one in? I will read it out one more time. So they create a social media hashtag campaign using the slogan hashtag Jewish Lives Matter. Do not condone, it is co-opting another movement's slogan. Yes, that's a good point. It is already another movement's slogan, one that's very, very similar. So it might not actually be very effective for what the students want to achieve. I think in this case, I would encourage them to maybe think of something a little bit more sort of unique to the, I would say that for number three, the hashtag might have to be changed. Yeah. People on the internet might strongly criticize the use of a hashtag that resembles the Black Lives Matter movement. So I would condone and not condone. Yeah. Thank you for that, Melanie and Derek. While there are a lot of intersections between a lot of these movements, they are still distinct in their own respects. So it's important to note that. Wonderful. Okay, so we're doing good so far. Let's keep going. Students organize a fundraiser to raise money for an organization that supports Jewish families. So they're organizing a fundraiser to raise money for an organization that supports Jewish families. Condone, not condone, somewhere in the middle. Any thoughts about where this might fall, potentially? May not relate so much to studying the Holocaust, so in the middle, perhaps. All right, perfect. Thank you, Judy. I think I would have to agree because it's not as related to addressing anti-Semitism. I agree with Hernan that it is still a really good idea, but it's not as sort of directly related to addressing anti-Semitism. I think I would encourage the students to delve deeper into the needs and what is the most impactful place for their money. Thank you for that comment as well, Derek. Yeah. So yes, I think that I feel comfortable leaving that in the middle. Very good idea, but just maybe doesn't relate directly to addressing anti-Semitism more directly. Okay, so I'm just gonna go back to the list here. I think I have one or two left. So students, the next example is students engage in an e-petition campaign to urge local newspapers and radio stations not to advertise a new film which the students say promotes negative Jewish stereotypes. So I'm gonna read that one more time because that one was a little bit long. So students engage in an e-petition campaign to urge local newspapers and radio stations not to advertise a new film which the students say promotes negative Jewish stereotypes. Curious about your thoughts on this one. Let me know what you think. So Minda said that she would condone it. I think it's a good one. Okay, so we will put that one in this. Yeah, I think it's a good one. I mean, I think addressing negative Jewish stereotypes, especially in media, is very important. So somebody said that they would second that. So condone if they have done a thorough and accurate analysis of the film. Yes, absolutely. So again, you really want to challenge your students to make sure that, you know, if they're going to do something like this, there is research involved, right? So definitely encourage them to do a thorough analysis of the film prior to creating a e-petition campaign, because they need to know what is the purpose of this, what is our message, and how confidently can we convey that, right? So doing that prior research is important. Perfect. Okay, so one last one. Thank you all for your participation so far. This is a very interesting activity, and I really appreciate your participation. The last one is students create a digital brochure and they distribute it online to alert people about Holocaust deniers. Condone, not condone, or condone if adjusted or revised. Might this not be a danger to them? Perhaps. That is a good thing to keep in mind. Again, we want to keep students' best interests at the forefront of our minds, even when they're considering what kinds of actions they want to take. That's incredibly important. So not condone for safety's sake. Thank you all for your answers. Appreciate it. Perfect. So I'm going to put that one here. So I hope this exercise was a little bit helpful to help you think about, you know, what are some actions that students might want to take? What are the possibilities? Again, they are free to use both digital and or traditional tactics and approaches. So that kind of opens up the realm of possibility. And so it's important to kind of think about, you know, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, how might students adjust their action projects so that it's feasible and it makes sense. So these are all incredibly good conversations and discussions to have with your students. All right, so I don't want to take too much more time because we still do have one activity left. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and this is the part folks, where we're going to go into breakout rooms. So just to kind of preface this next activity, when you're teaching about the Holocaust, you're likely to run into many different scenarios that actually might be quite tricky to navigate in a classroom setting. So to help us understand how to best respond to some of these potential classroom situations, we're going to put you all into breakout rooms. We're going to discuss various scenarios that might come up in your classroom when you're teaching about the Holocaust. And your task is to come up with potential solutions or responses to each to the scenarios. So we're going to share a document in the Google chat. Thank you for putting it in there. So this document, it's a Google document. It contains 7 different scenarios. And again, your task is to, in your groups, once you're in the breakout rooms, select one scenario. It doesn't have to, you don't have to start with number 1. You can choose to start with number 4 if that speaks to you more. That's perfectly okay. So select one of the scenarios, discuss it with your group, and together come up with the best possible reaction, response, or solution to it. So that's what you're tasked with. And if you do get through your first chosen scenario really quickly and there's still time in the breakout room, you're more than welcome to continue and choose a second scenario and choose a third scenario if you would like. And then we will come back in the plenary and we will discuss. I will call on a couple people to share in the chat, what their solution was that they came up with. Okay. So are there any questions about this next activity before we move into the breakout rooms? Are we all good? Okay, I will take silence as we're good to go. So let's go ahead and open up these breakout rooms. If you do have trouble opening if you can't access the Google document, please let us know. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the plenary. Lovely to see some of your faces. Very nice for me to move through the breakout rooms and sort of eavesdrop a little bit. Some very rich discussion going on, and it seemed like most groups got through at least 1 or 2 of the scenarios that I had listed. So I'm incredibly curious to hear about some potential responses and solutions to some of these scenarios that I laid out. Just so perhaps I can call on a few people just to, in the chat, summarize what you came up with as a group. So if anybody wants to share, you can just pick one of your scenarios. Just make sure in the chat that you write which scenario, the number, or just like a little line about what it was. So if it was the student not feeling comfortable or the gallery walk incident thing, then just make sure that you're identifying which scenario. So I will read a scenario and then I'll read your sort of solution that your group came up with. And from what I heard, there were some amazing ideas that were presented and some great solutions to some of these questions. So very excited to share all together. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Perfect. So I think Lorna raised their hand.
Hi, I'm just going to touch base quickly. My name is Lorna Evans, and I just wanted to say 2 quick things. One is I work for OCDSE, and I'm in a new role this year. I'm an equity coach with the anti-racism focus, and so I just wanted to, to introduce myself and thank you all for putting on this workshop. Part of my role is working on the Holy Days and Days of Significance portfolio. So, reach out to me. Feel free to email me if there's things you want to do. I did speak to the group when I was when we were talking about our things about the intersectionality, the importance of intersecting and not just saying, teaching in silos. And I it's something I feel very strongly about, that it's important that students are have equity literacy in a variety of formats. And so, when we were answering those questions, often that's sort of one of the things that I came back to, is that, of course, we need to stop right away. If somebody denies the Holocaust, that's not okay. Right away, that's something that we need to say, no, we we know that this exists, and talk about it in the past, in the present, and the future. And also just making those links. And so, for example, that might be something as simple as, Indigenous stories, that how, for many years, Indigenous people were not believed when there was residential schools, and some of the atrocities that took place there, that, people were, had passed and were there. And so sometimes making those connections and intersection connections, I think, are important for students to see how some of these stories interconnect and how they weave into each other. So I wanted to put that into the space, that it's important to interconnect, and leave it there. Thanks. And thanks for having this workshop for educators.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lorna, for that comment. I think it's an incredibly important comment, highlighting the intersectionality of a lot of different types of racism and discrimination that operate, that there is a lot of overlap, despite them also being distinct experiences. So absolutely, as many connections as you can make in your classrooms between issues of racism, the more your students will benefit from learning about these topics. Somebody in the chat said that their group selected number 4. So I'm going to quickly read number 4 just so we can all remind ourselves what that pertained to. So number 4 was when exploring the gallery walk activity, so the activity with photos, students start laughing at the anti-Jewish propaganda that was used by the Nazis in propaganda magazines and in recent online memes. So let's look at what we came up here with. Okay, perfect. So it was important to understand that laughter comes from a number of different places, and that as educators, we had a responsibility to try and teach students to understand the malevolence, I can't say that word, but I think you know what I'm talking about, behind the portrayals. Absolutely. And then another group focused on, thank you, James, for dropping that in the chat, number 6. So scenario number 6 was a student wanting to speak to one of the Holocaust survivors in person or on a virtual call to ask them questions about their experience. So James's group said that having the ability to connect with a person, having teachers able to connect with specific groups such as chess to understand that the request for a virtual visit is something that can be done and is available, even encouraged. So yeah, even in one of the lesson plan activities, we do encourage sort of this idea of, potentially communicating with survivors. The mediums can vary depending on the comfort of survivors, but even something like writing a letter or an email, just so that all of this sort of connects back, right? The students are doing action projects, but it might have been inspired by a survivor, so the survivor might want to hear about it. And it helps deepen learning when you can create that connection. So definitely reach out to Chess if that's something your students might be interested in. I think a really good segue into our Q&A segment. So this is an opportunity for questions, comments. Kenra will be joining me for this segment because she has tons of insights to offer. So if you have any questions, this is your time. We have a few moments for them, and feel free to use the chat to submit.
And feel free to ask questions about the workshop, about the work that we do, about ways in which the chess organization can be supported, or even if there are concerns that you have that you wouldn't mind getting out in the open and giving us an opportunity to address those. Okay, we've got one from Hernan.
Yeah, Hernan, hi, nice to meet you both. That's okay, no problem. I just wanted to ask, I'm too lazy to type anymore, so I'm just going this way. So I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I teach I teach history and Jewish studies. And I have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is sort of something that Lisa was already talking about, and I think is a large issue here, is this sort of the link between the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and this exposure to risk for Jewish students and faculty and etc. And I think that is, I don't know if there's really a question here or if there's something that we can sort of unpack in respect to how to, well, I guess the question is, how do we deal with this for students, right? I think that, let's take ourselves out of the equation. How do students deal with, or how do we help students deal with the complexity of that, given the particular climate that we find ourselves in? That's the first question. And then the other one is a sort of a broader one that I've had and I'm still I'm struggling with, is what will happen when there aren't tragically any survivors left to attend, to speak to the students, to speak the truth. I know that obviously things are being recorded, but it won't have the same effect. And so I wonder, beyond these sorts of virtual engagements that people are talking about, if there are other pathways to talking about the Holocaust that might be explorable, or that you think or you've heard about that can help us better articulate or continue to articulate these ideas. Those are my two questions. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this particular event and CHES, and for letting all my students be a part of this. Thank you.
Fantastic. So Sophia, I don't know if you want me to start and talk a little bit about question number one. I can segue a bit into number two, and then, Sophia, if you have anything to add, and, please let me know if you need me to clarify, or, if something needs to be further, I suppose, explored. So both really complicated questions, and I thank you for both. Regarding students, no simple answer to that. So I find that in the work that I've been doing with my students and the work that I've been doing, I noticed that Jacqueline Lawrence is here. Hi, Jackie. Jacqueline Lawrence is our Equity and Diversity Coordinator at the OCDSB. So in the work that I've been doing with students, as well as with the OCDSB and through CHES, some of the things that I try to keep in mind, mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of student safety, but always making sure that we are acknowledging, first and foremost, the concern coming from the student, coming from the family, or coming from the faculty member. So unfortunately, as we know, with a lot of the social justice work that is currently being done, one of the biggest issues occurs when somebody brings forward a concern and the response is, oh, I'm sure it's not that bad. Or, well, really, are you sure that you're interpreting it correctly, etc. So I think always acknowledging is very important, and finding the place from where the student is coming with respect to that concern. I think addressing it is also very important. So if it's something that's happened, for example, in a classroom situation, again, always talking to the student first in terms of how would you like me to address this? I can approach the specific source from which this comment came. We can do a class discussion, etc. And I've done a little bit of both. I find also that being open to addressing current issues. I mean, this is something that Lisa mentioned a little bit earlier. So when things are happening in the world, particularly, I'm going to go right back to, the crisis situation that occurred in the spring. One of the major issues that occurred from my point of view was that people did not want to touch that issue because it's so emotionally overwrought, but the students needed to speak about it. And it's important to take as unbiased an approach as possible, but also to get immediately onto the issues that we have with social media. And I find this, for me, has been a very helpful way in, because our students, our young people, are very familiar with social media. They know it like the back of their hands for the most part. And I will often say to them, let's take a look at things that are being posted. Let's take a look at whether this is something that we would say is legitimate, is supported by facts, or whether it is something that is inciting rather than educating. And I find there's a major difference with that. So this can at least help us generate the discussions so that people are aware. I find in the work that I do with Holocaust education, many of the students, no matter what their background, will come up and be very thankful, particularly because we relate it to current events and issues. And also we bring that back to the fact that this did not end with the Holocaust. We look at anti-Semitic incidents in our own communities, for example. There was a recent one, sadly, at the Elgin Street Courthouse. So addressing these issues, not letting them stand, I think conversations as staff together is very important. And you also mentioned faculty. Lisa also mentioned this in her comment, the fact that people sometimes can feel targeted by bringing forward their concerns. So I think that support groups are excellent. I think that reaching out to organizations like CHESS, like a couple of the organizations or initiative groups that Lisa brought forth, is very important. And realizing that these conversations have to happen, that's sort of very grassroots. But if we don't start actually having the conversations and people being open about, well, this is what's happening, this is what I'm hearing from students, then we won't progress. But in bringing it forward, in including the students in the dialogue, in including staff in the dialogue, I think that is definitely one of my first and foremost ways of trying to address things, and which I have found personally have been successful. So Sophia, I don't know if you want to add to that, and please let me know if there's anything that I didn't get to in that answer.
Actually, because we are running low on time, I'm going to let Lisa, I think you had raised your hand, if you want to quickly ask one last question.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Or make a comment. I don't know.
It wasn't a question. I keep losing connection. Apologies. Yeah, I would just say, I would like to say, first of all, the OCDSB, for the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, is really doing a great job. I have to say, since this September, with of course you already know Jackie, so that helps as the equity coordinator. But really doing a fantastic job at hearing the students and the parents and the teachers, and that's long overdue, not from the OCDSB, but just in general. And most of the comments that I've been getting are similar to what Kenra said, is that students would be going to their teachers, and again, not necessarily just in the OCDSB, but they would be going to their teachers and said, hey, he called me a dirty Jew, or hey, he dropped money on the floor and is making me pick it up, and hey, what does this mean? And teachers are saying, and again, not just within the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, teachers are saying, oh, he didn't mean it, don't worry about it. And it's that dismissiveness that needs to stop. It took so long. I'm very
good. Those are really great tidbits. I think that both you and Kenra did a good job of sort of helping to answer Hernan's questions. So thank you, Lisa, for those additional comments. Very, very helpful to the discussion. So I think that's all the time we had for discussion. And what I'm going to do now is let Kenra read a second poem for us.
All right, thanks, Sophia. So I do have one more poem to share with you, and this is actually the final poem in the first collection that I wrote that was inspired by my time in Israel and the work that I did there. So interestingly enough, Rated X is the first poem in this collection, and part of my objective was to move from the initiation of the Holocaust to the end in order to, or at least the end of the historical period that we come to recognize as being the time designated for Holocaust studies historically. I wanted to end with the tribute to survivors and survivor stories. So again, going back to something Hernan asked earlier, and Lisa addressed this as well, how can we continue to keep these stories alive despite the fact that we are sadly losing our survivors because, of course, of the age and where we're heading in that direction. And we need to remember that this is generational. There are second generation survivors, there are third generation, fourth and fifth, and the line will continue. So these stories do continue through that lineage. We raise our voices strong as one, our eyes upon the setting sun, to welcome in the Sabbath feast, knowing that when we look east, the sun for us shall rise tomorrow, one more step away from sorrow. Though we can never forget our pain, we shall move forward through sun and rain. With throbbing hearts, we dare to love, trusting in the one above to lead us to the promised land, to help our children understand that they are treasured every day. Their lives are cherished in every way. We see hope in our sons and daughters. After prolonged drought, we find living waters. Rejoicing when their hands clasp ours, their numbers shall match with the stars. In harmony, we sing as one, our faces turned towards the sun. Baruch Adonai Hamevarach Le'olam Va'ed. And I would like to now turn things over to Sophia for a very special welcome to a very special guest.
Thank you so much, Kenra. I have to say, both of your poems tonight have been incredibly powerful. So thank you for reading them both to us. All right, folks, so we are nearing the end of today's session. We do have a special guest to help close things off for us tonight. So when I was introducing myself, I mentioned that I was exposed to Holocaust education in my 6th grade class. And of course, I had to invite my grade 6 teacher, Mr. Patrick Masko, to come join us tonight and leave us with some parting words. So Patrick Masko is a teacher in the OCDSB here in Ottawa. He's an award-winning teacher, and he has done many, many years of Holocaust education programming with his students. So I'm very excited to have him here with us. Patrick, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. Hello, everyone. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough. I'd like to congratulate everyone for being here and participating and gaining knowledge regarding the importance of Holocaust education. I'd also like to thank the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship for hosting today's events. Before I tell you about my experience with Holocaust education, I just want to tell you how different this particular Zoom experience is for me right now. So I usually teach grade 6, but because my wife has a compromised immune system, I am this year teaching grade 3 virtually. So I am actually probably for the first time this year presenting to an audience that might be listening to me. And I will do my best not to refer to people as boys and girls, as long as everyone could promise not to write in the chat like totally random questions, like just like, guess how much I just ate, or do you want to see me do a headstand? Today in math, I was teaching division, and I asked if there were any questions. A little girl raised her hand and asked me if I liked unicorns. I told her I like unicorns that can divide. So this is where I am coming from. I am coming from a place where most of my audience members are in pajamas. So the great thing about 8-year-olds is that they are so open and honest, and maybe sometimes too honest, because when they ask me how old I am, and then I tell them in 60, they are like convinced I'm ancient and lived with the dinosaurs. The other thing that's really great about 8-year-olds is that they're not judgmental. They're not looking for reasons to hate or to discriminate. And I fully believe that racism, discrimination, and hatred are learned characteristics, which means attitudes can be combated through education. Immediately after 9/11, religious intolerance openly surfaced within my school and the high school next door. I witnessed numerous displays of anti-Semitic behavior. My school, Charles H. Hulse, has a very large Muslim population. The students would openly tell me that Jews were their enemies. I was even told by neighboring high school teachers that the grade 10 students walked out during history classes and denied the legitimacy of the Holocaust. I decided right then that if the grade 10s are not listening, then maybe tolerance and respect needs to be taught at a much earlier age. So I started with my grade 6s. I chose to start teaching my students Holocaust education because Holocaust education really is character education. If some kids have learned to hate by the age of 16, then maybe we need to start fixing the problem when they're 10 or 11. In Germany during the Second World War, less than 1% of the population was Jewish. So as a result, many people did not help their Jewish neighbors because often they didn't know Jewish people. There was no human connection. Excuse me. Yet there were still people that did stand up and do the right thing. Some people spoke out against what was happening. Others took action. Groups like the White Rose, Albanian Muslims, the individuals like Jan Zabinski, Raoul Wallenberg, Oskar Schindler, all chose to take action rather than act as silent bystanders. Around 2002, I started a pen pal program with my grade 6 students and the grade 6 students from the Ottawa Jewish Community School. I also established a day where students would meet, participate in team building activities, and we called it a day of cultural understanding. The highlight of the day was hearing from a gentleman by the name of David Shinto, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. He never actually spoke about anti-Semitism. What he said was hatred of any kind was like a cancer. It will grow and destroy everything in its path. David would come back every year for over 10 years as our guest of honor. And he really helped change a number of attitudes. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I guess, I initially met David at an event very much like the one that we're at tonight. Good citizenship, character, and standing up against racism doesn't just happen. Change can only take place by initiating a sustainable program that challenges one's critical thinking over time. My students who had never met Jews before are now familiar with their history. They've been playing and working with them side by side. When this happens, people are forced to take a much deeper look and see more than just labels. My program's been running for almost 20 years now. During that time, we've had a number of high-profile guests, such as Rabbi Bulka, who was mentioned as sadly recently passed away, Mayor Jim Watson, former Premier Dalton McGuinty, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. However, the focus was always on the students in providing them with a perspective they had not been exposed to. Over a period of time, my students have become leaders in the field of tolerance. The Holocaust is one of the most documented and historically researched examples of racism, discrimination, and genocide the world has ever seen. The lessons are there to be used and can be historically verified. My friend David Shinto lost his family, almost lost his life, suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder until the day he died. Nobody helped him. In comparison, Ottawa Holocaust survivor Ellie Beauregard, who I see is here, hi Ellie, was hidden as a child. She was protected. She was cared for by people who chose not to allow racism to cloud their judgment. She became a nationally recognized scientist and has lived a happy and full life. I believe it is so important that we as teachers address character education on a daily basis. Not every student will need to hear what you have to say. In some cases, parents have already done that job, but your lessons will never be wasted. They'll simply be reinforced. One of our moderators today, Sophia Murray, was a former student of mine, and I just want to say how proud I am of her. And today she works in the field of human rights. She was a young lady who in grade 6 already displayed character and tolerance. I really never worried about Sophia or how she would turn out. As a teacher, you never really know who you're reaching or who needs to hear your message. Just last week, I received an email from another former student who is about to graduate high school. This was a student that was described by many teachers as having no heart and considered likely to end up in prison. We chatted back and forth, and then he sent me a photo of myself and David Shinto. He said, "I still remember that old man's story. That was deep." So that young man that many teachers perhaps had written off was obviously moved by David's story even all these years later. So a teacher's job is to teach. When you see an issue, you need to address it. Okay? Don't look the other way. Don't stand around and hope the problems will go away. Don't wait for someone else to take the initiative. We are not meant to be bystanders. We're meant to be leaders. So it's up to us to teach and use education to campaign against all forms of discrimination and racism. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish everyone all the best.
Well, thank you, Patrick. We are so fortunate to call you a friend and supporter of chess. Thanks for the remarkable work you do. It's extraordinary. We would also like to thank our sponsors one more time. And in closing, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Thanks to Kenra and Sophia for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking workshop. I would like to share that each year, chess honors a teacher who demonstrates exemplary work in Holocaust education with the Ari van Mansen Award, a tribute to a righteous Gentile from the Netherlands who lived in Ottawa. If you know of such an educator, please recommend them to us. For info, please visit our website. Chess's expertise and resources are available to you all year round. And please feel free to reach out to us. I'll remind you also that the content of this workshop will be on our website within the next couple of days. So you're welcome to find it there. And that's it. So have a good evening, and thanks again for joining us, to all of you. Good night.